Welcome to Sinister States.
I grew up on the north edge of town, where the houses thin out and the roads stop pretending they know where they're going. Past my childhood street, there's a stretch of trees that everyone pretends isn't there, because on the other side of it sits the old mine shaft. No sign, no fence, just a dark cut in the rock, like the land forgot to heal. People talk about it the way they talk about storms that happened before you were born, with distance, with respect, with the understanding that you don't need details to know better. When I was a kid, the mine was a boundary. You didn't cross it because there was nothing past it worth seeing. When I got older, it became a joke, a place for dares and rumors and half-remembered stories told around tailgates. I didn't believe any of it, not really. I believed in rot and negligence and bad air and old wood. I believed the mine was dangerous in the boring, predictable way, the kind of danger you can plan for with rope and lights and common sense. That belief is why I went in. It started with the smell. Even before you see the opening, you can smell it, like wet pennies and cold dirt and something faintly sweet that doesn't belong underground. The opening itself is smaller than people imagine. Not a cavern, just a mouth forced open with timbers that have gone gray and soft with age. Someone spray-painted a warning years ago, but it's mostly peeled away, leaving the suggestion of words instead of the message. I stood there longer than I meant to, listening. There's a sound mines make, even when they're empty, a slow breathing, air moving where it shouldn't, water finding paths through stone. I told myself that was all it was. I told myself I'd go in just far enough to see the old rails and turn back. I even said it out loud, like that made it a promise instead of a lie. I brought gear: headlamp, backup flashlight, rope, chalk, phone sealed in plastic. I did everything right. That's important, because what happened next wasn't because I was careless. The first few yards were exactly what I expected. The air dropped in temperature and pressed against my skin. My light caught on old supports, on rusted bolts, on rails half buried in silt. Water dripped somewhere deeper in, steady enough to mark time. I moved slow, counting steps, touching the wall every so often to keep myself oriented. The walls weren't smooth. They were scarred with tool marks, grooves cut by hands that expected the rock to give. There were initials carved here and there, dates that stopped decades ago. It felt like walking through a museum exhibit no one bothered to lock. About 50 yards in, the floor dipped and the sound changed. The drip became a hollow plunk, echoing back wrong, like the space had learned to lie. My light didn't reach as far anymore. It was being swallowed. I remember thinking the mine felt bigger than it should. That happens underground sometimes. Your sense of scale slips. But this was different. The tunnel widened without warning, the ceiling lifting out of view. The rails vanished into the darkness ahead, and the walls stepped back as if giving me room. That should have been my cue to leave. Instead, I stood there grinning like an idiot, impressed. I remember thinking no one had ever described this part, and feeling a small, stupid pride at being the one to see it. That's when I noticed the footprints, not mine. They were pressed into the damp silt along the right wall, bare impressions without tread. They weren't deep, like whoever made them didn't weigh much, and they weren't random. They followed the wall in a careful line, each one placed with intention. I crouched to look closer, telling myself it was probably kids messing around, maybe some local daredevil. The prints were wrong for that. Too narrow, toes too long. I took a picture, because that's what you do when something doesn't fit. You document it like evidence will make it behave. The flash went off, and for a split second the tunnel ahead reflected light back at me, not the dull scatter of stone, but a smooth gleam like wet skin. The air shifted. I don't mean a draft, I mean the pressure changed, like something had inhaled. The dripping stopped. My headlamp flickered once. Just once, enough to make my stomach drop. I stood up too fast and hit my shoulder on nothing because the wall was farther away than it had been a second before. I know how that sounds. I know tunnels don't move. I know. But my hand met empty air where rock had been. I backed up, slow, telling myself it was panic, telling myself I'd misjudged. When my heel caught on the rail, I nearly fell, and in that moment of imbalance, I heard it, a sound like breath trying to remember how to be quiet. I didn't run. That's another thing people expect. The terror makes you bolt. It doesn't. It makes you careful. I turned my light off and stood there, heart punching my ribs, listening. The dark wasn't total. There's never total dark when your eyes are working, just a suggestion of shapes. In that suggestion, something moved. Not toward me, along the wall, following the same path as the footprints, but higher, like it didn't need the floor. The sound it made wasn't footsteps, it was friction, a soft dragging punctuated by a wet click, like joints finding purchase where they weren't meant to bend. I whispered, "Hello." I don't know why. Maybe part of me still believed in people. The sound stopped. The pressure changed again, a little closer this time. My light came back on by itself. I didn't touch it. The beam cut across the tunnel and caught on something pale pressed against the rock. It wasn't a face. It was too long for that. A stretch of something with shallow pits where eyes might have been, ridged with lines like old scars. It was smiling, not with a mouth, but with the tension of skin pulled tight over bone. When it moved, the tunnel answered, stone groaning in sympathy, dust drifting down like dry snow. I backed away until my shoulders met the narrow part again, until the walls were close enough to be familiar. The thing didn't follow. It watched. I could feel it doing that, a weight of attention that made my skin prickle. I told myself that was good, that it meant I could leave. I turned, slow, and started back the way I'd come, counting steps, touching the wall, keeping my breathing shallow. Behind me, the dragging resumed, but not closer. It kept pace, matching my speed exactly, like it was curious how I'd handle the walk. The tunnel seemed longer going out. I know that's common, but this was absurd. Landmarks I remembered didn't appear when they should have. The initials blurred together. The drip returned, but out of rhythm, like a bad recording. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a notification from nowhere. I didn't check it. I didn't dare break my focus. When I finally saw the faint gray of daylight ahead, relief hit me so hard my knees went weak. I stumbled the last few yards and burst out into the trees, gasping, laughing, the sound tearing out of me without permission. The opening looked the same from the outside. Quiet. Empty. The smell faded as I backed away. I told myself I'd imagined it, that fear had dressed up shadows and echoes in old stone. I drove home shaking, dumped my gear on the floor, and sat under the shower until the water ran cold. I almost convinced myself. Almost. Then I checked my phone. There was one photo I didn't remember taking. It showed the tunnel from behind me, the narrow part stretching away, and in the center of the frame, pressed into the silt, were fresh footprints leading out, overlapping mine. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that pressure again, the sense of being regarded by something patient and impersonal. The photo sat on my phone like a dare. I must have opened it 100 times, zooming in, looking for proof that it was a trick of light or motion blur. The footprints were undeniable. They were clearer than mine, edges sharp, toes splayed just enough to suggest weight distributed wrong. I told myself someone could have followed me in, played a joke, snuck out behind me. That explanation fell apart the longer I thought about it. There was no way past me in that tunnel, no space to squeeze by without brushing shoulders, no sound, no warning. And yet the prints were there, heading out, overlapping my own like we'd walked together. The next morning, the town looked unchanged. Same sagging storefronts, same diner with the flickering sign, same people pretending the edge of town wasn't an edge at all. I went to work on autopilot, answering emails, nodding at conversations, feeling like I was slightly out of sync with everything. At lunch, I finally cracked and showed the photo to Mark from accounting, because he's the kind of guy who believes in rational explanations with religious fervor. He squinted at it, shrugged, and said it was probably an animal. A raccoon, maybe. I almost laughed. Raccoons don't walk barefoot and polite. Still, his dismissal helped in a way. It gave me something to push against. By the end of the day, I'd convinced myself I needed closure. I needed to go back, not inside, just close enough to prove to myself that nothing was waiting. I drove out there just before sunset, parking farther away this time. The trees swallowed sound the same way they always had. Birds quieted as the light dipped, but that's normal. I told myself that too. The mine opening sat in shadow, unchanged, unbothered by my attention. I didn't cross the tree line. I stood there and watched, counting breaths, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. No smell carried on the air, no wrongness pressed at my ears. Relief crept in, slow and tentative. I took out my phone, snapped a picture from a distance, and turned to leave. That's when I heard the dragging again. Not from the mine, from the trees behind me. It was faint, easy to mistake for branches rubbing together, but once you know a sound, you don't unhear it. I froze, heart hammering, and listened. The dragging circled, slow, methodical, staying just out of sight. I thought about running and didn't. I thought about yelling and didn't. I whispered, again asking who was there. The sound stopped. The air shifted, subtle this time, like a held breath released somewhere far away. When I turned, there was nothing. Just trees and long shadows, and the sense that I'd passed some kind of test by not bolting. I didn't go back the next day, or the next. I avoided the edge of town entirely, took longer routes, filled my time with noise and people. For a while, it worked. The dreams faded, the pressure eased. I started to believe I'd left it behind, that whatever curiosity I'd sparked had lost interest. That belief lasted until the knock. It came just after midnight. 3 soft taps on my front door. I live alone. No one visits unannounced, especially that late. I stood in my hallway, listening, telling myself it was a neighbor, a mistake, anything normal. The taps came again, spaced evenly, patient. I approached the door on shaking legs and looked through the peephole. No one was there. The porch light illuminated empty boards in the far edge of my lawn. I almost opened it, almost convinced myself the angle hid someone. My phone buzzed in my hand, a text from an unknown number. "You left something behind." I didn't respond. I backed away from the door and locked myself in my bedroom, lights on, heart racing. The knocking didn't come again. The text didn't repeat. By morning, I decided it was a prank, some sick coincidence layered on an already bad experience. I blocked the number and went to work, determined to reclaim normal. That resolve cracked around noon when I found damp footprints on the linoleum by my kitchen sink. Bare, narrow, leading from the back door to the counter, stopping inches from where I'd stood to make coffee. I called in sick and drove to the library because it felt safer than home. I dug through local records, old newspapers, anything that mentioned the mine. There were accidents, of course, collapses, gas pockets, men trapped and never recovered. That's the story everyone knows. What I found buried deeper were the rumors, reports of people hearing voices underground long after the mine closed, of rescue teams refusing to go back in after seeing shapes moving without light. One article mentioned a surveyor who claimed the tunnels didn't match the maps, that distances shifted when he wasn't looking. He was laughed out of town. He left a month later, no forwarding address. I was closing the file when the librarian asked if I needed help. She was older, hair pulled back tight, eyes sharp. I showed her the photo. She didn't laugh. She sighed, long and tired, and told me to put it away. Some places, she said, don't like being looked at too closely. I asked her what she meant. She told me her grandfather worked the mine, that he'd come home once talking about a corridor that wasn't there before, about stone that felt warm. He went back the next day and never returned. They found his helmet weeks later, clean and dry, sitting at the entrance like it had been placed. I went home before dark and packed a bag. I didn't know where I was going, only that staying felt worse. As I loaded my car, I felt that pressure again, closer than it had ever been. The dragging sounded from my driveway, soft and intimate. I turned, and for a heartbeat, I saw it standing at the edge of my porch light. Not fully, just enough to understand scale and intent. It was taller than a man, but folded in on itself, limbs bent at wrong angles to fit the space. Its skin caught the light like wet stone. It didn't move toward me. It didn't have to. It knew where I was going. I drove until dawn, until the town was a memory in my rearview mirror. I thought distance would help. I was wrong. The first motel I stopped at had damp footprints leading from the bathroom to the bed. The second had none, but the air felt heavy, expectant. By the third night, I understood. It wasn't following me. It was waiting. Waiting for me to stop running. Waiting for me to realize that curiosity is a door, and some doors don't close when you step back through. I don't know how long I can keep moving. I don't know if there's a place far enough away. All I know is that when I close my eyes, I can feel stone pressing close, hear the patient drag of something that learned my shape and decided it fit.
I stopped checking motels after the third night. Too many variables, too many places for it to wait. I slept in my car instead, parking under lights, new noise, anywhere that felt observed by something other than me. That worked for a while, or maybe it only felt like it did. The pressure stayed distant, like a headache you learn to ignore. I told myself that meant I was winning, that whatever line I'd crossed back at the mine couldn't stretch forever. I was wrong about that, too. The first real sign came outside a gas station 2 counties over. I'd pulled in just before sunrise, the sky that washed-out gray-blue that makes everything look unfinished. I went inside, paid, used the bathroom, lingered longer than necessary because the place smelled like coffee and disinfectant instead of wet stone. When I came back out, my windshield was fogged from the inside. That shouldn't have been possible. I hadn't slept there. I wiped it with my sleeve and froze. A handprint bloomed out of the fog as I cleared it, pressed from the inside, fingers long and slightly too many knuckled, the heel of the palm smeared like it had leaned there, waiting. I didn't scream. I laughed, a short, broken sound that hurt my throat. There was nothing inside the car, no moisture, no smell. The print faded as the glass cooled, leaving me with nothing to point at, nothing to show. I drove until my hands cramped, until my shoulders ached from tension. The radio cut in and out, cycling through static and half-heard voices that sounded too close to whispers. I turned it off and drove in silence. By the end of the week, I understood the pattern. It didn't approach me directly anymore. It didn't need to. It made itself known in small, deniable ways. Footprints that led nowhere. Reflections that lagged by a fraction of a second. That pressure, always just at the edge of awareness, like standing too close to a large animal that hasn't decided what you are yet. When I stopped, it grew heavier. When I moved, it eased. The implication was clear. Motion mattered. I tried reaching out for help. I called my parents and lied about a job opportunity, about needing space. I called Mark from accounting and told him the truth in fragments, listening to his patience fray with every sentence. He told me I was stressed, that trauma does things to the brain. He suggested therapy. I thanked him and hung up. Therapy requires staying in one place long enough to be found. The dreams came back eventually. Not nightmares exactly, replays, but from angles I hadn't seen. The mine from above, the trees bending inward like ribs, the tunnel widening, narrowing, breathing. In the dreams, I always understood something at the last moment, some crucial rule I'd missed, but I woke before I could name it. I started leaving my lights on, even when I slept in the car. Darkness felt like an invitation. I don't know when I stopped being surprised by it. There was a morning in a rest area bathroom when I caught a glimpse of movement behind the farthest stall, a shape folding itself to fit, and instead of fear, I felt irritation. I slammed the door and told it to stop, out loud. The pressure receded a fraction, like a tide pulling back. That was when it clicked. It wasn't just waiting, it was listening. I tested it carefully. Rules, I'd learned, mattered. I set boundaries in small ways. I told it where I was going, when I was leaving. I spoke like it was a skittish animal, calm, firm, not challenging. When I did, the signs lessened. The footprints grew fainter. The reflections behaved. The pressure never left, but it settled, a constant weight instead of a looming one. I hated that it worked. I hated what that implied about consent, about attention.
Weeks passed, then months. I stopped driving aimlessly and started choosing places with intention. Wide open spaces where the sky pressed down instead of closing in. Deserts, plains, places where sound carried and there was nowhere to hide. It didn't like those places. The pressure thinned there, stretched out, uncomfortable. I began to think I might outrun it by changing the rules of the environment, by refusing to give it the enclosed spaces it preferred. That illusion shattered in a canyon in Utah. I'd hiked down at dusk, chasing the echo of my own footsteps because it felt good to hear something answer me honestly. The walls rose up on either side, stone layered and ancient. The air cooled. I felt it then, stronger than it had in months, a delighted focus that made my teeth buzz. The canyon narrowed ahead, and I knew, with a clarity that left no room for denial, that it had always been able to find me. It had just been indulging me. The dragging sound came from above, from below, from everywhere at once. Pebbles skittered down the walls as something moved where gravity shouldn't allow it. I ran, heart in my throat, lungs burning, and for the first time since the mine, it chased me. Not fast, not frantic, confident. The canyon bent and twisted, every turn another promise of enclosure. I stumbled, scraped my hands raw, kept going. When I burst out into open ground, I collapsed, sobbing, the sound torn from me by relief and rage. It didn't follow me out. It stopped at the mouth of the canyon, pressure pooling there like a storm front. I lay on my back and stared at the stars, understanding finally settling in. It wasn't bound to the mine. That had just been the place it learned to reach out. It was bound to attention, to curiosity, to the shape of me once I'd seen it and been seen in return. I don't write this as a warning. Warnings assume choice. I write it as a record, as proof that there are things you don't stumble into by accident, things that require you to meet them halfway with interest and disbelief and the arrogance of thinking you can step back when you've had enough. I think about the mine sometimes, about how small the opening was, how easy it would have been to walk past without looking. I think about all the places like it, the forgotten cuts in the world that breathe and wait. It's near me now as I write this. I can feel it, settled in, patient as ever. I stopped running last night. I parked somewhere quiet, somewhere enclosed because I was tired. Because motion takes energy, and energy runs out. The pressure feels almost gentle now, like a hand on my shoulder. I don't know what happens next. I only know that when you go looking into the dark, sometimes the dark learns your name, and it never forgets. I woke just before dawn with the certainty that something had changed. Not the pressure itself, but its quality. It felt focused now, no longer diffuse, like a decision had finally been made. I stayed still, listening to my own breathing, the faint tick of cooling metal from the car. When I opened my eyes, the windshield was clear. The world outside washed in that pale, in-between light. For a moment, I let myself believe I was alone. Then I noticed the dust on the dashboard. A single line ran through it, deliberate, drawn by something with patience. It wasn't a handprint this time, no attempt to imitation, just a mark, straight and intentional, as if to say, I am here, and I don't need to pretend anymore. The pressure settled heavier, intimate now, like standing too close to a wall you know will move if you lean on it. I spoke because silence felt worse. I told it I understood,
That I knew it wasn't about the mine or the canyon or any specific place. It was about the moment I'd chosen to keep going instead of turning back. About attention given freely and then regretted. As I talked, the pressure eased. Not gone, but adjusted. Like a weight shifted to rest more comfortably. I realized then that this was the bargain. Awareness in exchange for restraint. A watcher acknowledged. The car rocked once, gently, like someone testing their footing. I didn't look. I kept my eyes forward and finished what I needed to say. I told it I was done running, that I would stay here in this space and accept whatever came next. The rocking stopped. The air felt less dense, though not empty. I waited a long time until the sun crested fully and the day asserted itself. When I finally stepped out of the car, there were no footprints, no marks, just my own shadow stretching long across the pavement. The pressure lingered, faint but present, like a scar you feel when the weather changes. I drove back toward town after that, not the old one, somewhere new, somewhere ordinary. I found an apartment, a job, routines. Life resumed its shape around the absence I carried. It's been months now. Most days I almost forget. Almost. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a hallway, or when a room feels just a little too narrow, I feel it settle close, content to observe. It doesn't chase anymore. It doesn't need to. It already knows where I am. I'm telling you this because you might stand one day at the edge of somewhere forgotten and feel that pull, that itch to look closer. You'll tell yourself it's harmless, that curiosity is a virtue. I won't tell you not to go. I can't. I'll only say this. Once something notices the shape of your attention, it never really lets go. And if you're careful, if you're quiet, you might learn to live with the weight of being known.